Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier, and today we're going to be discussing the latest books that Rip Rap has received, including those on Paris underwater and the rise of the post-hip-hop generation and others. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randall.
Great to be here, thank you.
The first book I found really fascinating is called Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910 by Jeffrey Jackson. And I found this fascinating because a lot of people don't realize that Paris did have severe flood. It was an awful thing. And that it was like our own impact of Katrina in New Orleans. And there was also that element of impending disaster starting to happen, people not really wanting to believe it. The river Seine was starting to rise. There were different factors what was happening, including storms and all that kind of thing. But it was the reaction of this huge city that is a major metropolitan area for all of France. That was both good and bad for the people around it, because when things started going wrong, it affected all the surrounding communities. But I thought one thing that fascinated me was a comment that this book makes, that how a community tells the story of disaster is often crucial to the city's recovery. And it talks about how in San Francisco, just years before the flood there, or the flood in Paris, that the San Francisco city leaders discussed the 1906 earthquake and claimed the damage had mostly been caused by fire, not by catastrophic seismic event, because they could deal with fire. The seismic introduced that whole element of unpredictability.
Absolutely. You can't do a thing. I mean, you're at the mercy of nature.
And so that's similar to the thing with Paris, is that they tried to focus on the rebuilding part, and they told a story about the power of engineering to confront the forces of nature. But actually what happened was really incredible. At one point, a factory that was manufacturing vinegar mixed with other chemicals and exploded. A plant where they were manufacturing electricity, just burned down. I mean, it was just absolutely catastrophic. You had, they talk in this one chapter, the river attacks, is when, what was fascinating, for example, is all the different technologies they had in place. They had gas lights that had to be lit every night. Well, when you have flooding water, you can't get to the gas lights to light them. You know, a lot of it was they didn't have supermarkets like now, and so they had these little shops. Well, if they give too much water, it's very difficult to get those shops.
Sure.
And,
right. And plus distributing. I mean, the whole warehouse. We have different methods of distribution today, but it's such a distribution hub, Paris, and people coming.
Well, the markets that were there, the dry goods merchants, butchers, bakers, and other food vendors stored their stocks in basements,
right? Yeah.
Which were flooded, so they didn't have food to sell.
The parallel to Katrina is very interesting. I mean, 100 years previous, and there have been other major floods in, like Florence, for instance, which of course was a artistic as well as a economic disaster. But
and I think with this whole idea, well, it can't happen here. I mean, they really have not had that many disasters like this, so that was one of the things that they had to get used to. But another thing was that Paris has a very adequate sewer system, but when it flooded, there was so much water pouring in that things were pouring out of pipes were bursting above ground, which was just and then that caused all the thing with sewage and refuse, I should say, and all this stuff flowing around. And it was really unnerving about what they had to go through. At one point, they had to get more boats because people simply couldn't get around.
Yeah.
And so they were taking fishing boats from the coast and bringing them down by the hundreds, because you have this huge city that's immobile. And
of course, the river, even in flood stage like that, becomes a navigation problem in itself. I mean, this is the river that essentially drains all of France.
Well, in a river that normally is about a
It
quarter
was the
mile
northern
wide,
part of France.
and at the peak of the flood was 3¼ miles wide.
Yeah,
That's a
Yeah.
lot of water.
that is, yeah.
A lot of water, and there's just, they have electric, trains that were being run on electricity, but the tracks were 2 or 3 feet below water.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are you gonna do with that?
Well, it's interesting because the infrastructure of Paris was is so renowned. I mean, Paris is often called the capital of the 19th century. Certainly, by
Yeah.
1910, it was sort of the height of its industrial, kind of representing industrial culture, and these systems of infrastructures that were sort of leading world infrastructures in terms of designs.
Well, it was so fascinating that, the different technologies they have were overwhelmed.
Coffee.
By a force of nature, they just overwhelmed.
Mhm.
Couldn't deal with it. And these were very sturdy structures, but it wasn't working well. And
Why
this-
do you think, excuse me, why do you think historically it's been kind of missed in terms of,
Why it was a mess? I think it's one of these flukes where other things happen and people, it's just not something where people think of it, and so then they forget it. And I think that's one of the useful things about it. France has also had later floods, and people think more about those like in the early 90s, in the early 2002, and they forget about 1910.
it's interesting what we learned from these lessons, because there were tragic floods, absolutely tragic floods in Holland immediately after World War II in the early 50s, and which led to these phenomenal water that we know of today, Rotterdam and the fame that the Dutch have for building these water control systems, because obviously they're a lowland, very low country, underwater in fact. But it's kind of the infrastructure that comes as the result of some massive disaster.
Well, and that whole thing, well, it can't happen here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here in January 26th, for example, the sewers underneath the post office's main building near the Louvre overflowed, and water trickled into the central telegraph exchange, and suddenly 728 telegraph lines, including 32 devoted to international messages, were threatened and
Out.
then cut off.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes it
Well,
really
the
rough.
parallel to Katrina's really pertinent here. because
And they
this
had
is-
worked very hard to prevent this. They had been taking stones and they had been building stuff up with stacks with cement and all this stuff, and it just would not handle the massive
Yeah.
attack of the river, as they say. And so I found this really fascinating that you have this situation that parallels so much, and then, like you were saying before, that it just is forgotten, Yeah, and the overwhelming amount of water is just unbelievable, But what's also happened is that people around Europe started contributing to and trying to help out as best they could the people who were in the flood, because everybody started becoming aware this is really bad.
It's affecting.
So it's also kind of like the Haiti thing now,
Yes, yeah.
is that there is this, it said by January 27th, much of the world was reaching out to Paris in its time of need. So they started sending food and, aid and money to help them out, and the Parisians felt kind of awkward about this, but they had no choice. And then they had these rescue boats. This is a fascinating thing that police and soldiers would show up to help people, and so an occupants of a rescue boat or a shelter suddenly became neighbors and maybe great friends. And so it said, bringing into contact bodies that would never touch so directly. So a soldier and a proper middle-class woman, a servant and wealthy employer, the whole thing is they had to deal with
Well,
this.
this is what nature does, especially when nature kind of takes over. It reduces social levels very quickly. It doesn't matter who you are, because you're both in the situation where you're.
But they had points where paving stones were just being
Just being
lifted
pulled up.
right off the street. because of the pressure of the
Right,
water.
right.
And they tried to, use sandbags and everything else, and they got, and then there was a lot of gas, natural gas they were using.
Mhm.
And when those lines broke, there was a huge problem
Mm.
because you have to repair them so carefully, or otherwise they'll
Right, the
explode.
sparks could certainly.
And so they were talking about in here about how they were putting balloons on the one end of the supply line to contain it,
Mhm.
until they could deal with it.
Mhm.
Pretty interesting stuff. So I found this really fascinating, what they went through, and then the aftermath. And then of course, the next problem is when the water recedes. Now you got sewage and refuse and garbage
Massive
and all that
problems to
stuff,
clean up.
and infection.
Mhm.
And so they were shutting down whole buildings that said that they were infected until they had a chance to go through and sanitize them.
Yes, right.
That they were gonna have to deal with that. And that really, and then they had different, like whole apartment buildings that felt that they hadn't been paid attention to with their disaster. And so they would show solidarity, get together, put a petition to the government saying, you've gotta deal with this, because, we have no gas, or there's still all this sewage around. And so it went from the city of light to what they said, the city of mud and filth.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's,
Because the water just carries it all. And obviously, you
it
can't,
doesn't care.
it doesn't recede as equally as it expands or rises.
But then there was the same phase that's happened with other disasters, where they tried to understand what had happened and how to forfend against
Mhm.
the disaster that had happened. And that's when like you mentioned before, they
Mhm.
decided they had to protect their major infrastructure better against that kind of
Yeah.
flooding.
Right.
The gas lines, the electrical lines, the communication lines, and all that stuff. And then they have different stories about people and getting the telegraph lines back up, and they had to rebuild the quay walls and all this stuff that they had to go through. So it was quite fascinating that here in a city where you think is so efficient, modern, that they could have this kind of a disaster.
Well, they had systems which worked very well, but obviously not to the point where it could handle a flood like that. I mean, the efficiency, one could build, a model. Imagine, this is probably a very simplistic example, but you take a parking lot at a major building. They build the parking lot well. They could build it as when it would be completely full, but most of the time it's only going to be maybe a third or half as full on a regular daily basis. But maybe twice a year you'll have a large event that would maybe fill the parking lot. But they might not build it as full capacity because it's just economically unfeasible. So perhaps it's sort of like this: how do you build a system that can handle any kind of threat or disaster?
Well, the same thing with Katrina.
And
If they
Katrina's
did
a
one
perfect-
version, it would cost,
They
I
thought
forgot
that
how
they
many
could.
billion of dollars it would cost to have, levees that would really handle it. Or do you do it, instead of for the 100-year storm, do you build it for the 15-year
Yeah,
storm or something?
right.
But one thing that was really nice about this is how people pull together when there's attack from an external enemy, whether it's natural or human.
Mm-hmm.
And then they talk about how they said students of disaster speak of a kind of euphoria and utopian spirit that happens in the aftermath of a shocking event. And that's really kind of really. They talk about a ship exploded in Halifax Harbor in 1917. People rallying what one scholar called a city of comrades. 1937, the Louisville, Kentucky flood had a democracy of distress. So I think in 1997, the Red River flood in Grand Forks, North Dakota, a staff reporter for the local newspaper reported that the water also took us to new levels of strength, compassion, resolve, and caring.
Interesting.
So that was interesting. But like I said, in the aftermath, the city has quite deliberately tried to also become greener, because one of the factors that people felt was they had done a big deforestation program above Paris, and they felt that increased the amount of runoff water.
this is a direct parallel to Katrina because, as you
Yeah.
know, the technologies, the mechanical technologies of the flood control and whatnot that were built by the Corps of Engineers in Katrina were completely compromised by the ecological or environmental destruction that had been happening systematically over many years by taking away all the flood, the eddies and the estuaries and all
Yeah.
the getting rid of the floodplains that were naturally there at the bottom of the Mississippi. So when the hurricane came in, it had had no buffer zone to kind of stop it and take the waters, the rising flood waters and whatnot.
Well, and he ends the book talking about, yet Parisian society functioned well enough to propel the city and its inhabitants through some deeply trying days.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this a really fascinating book because he's not looking only at this disaster, but putting in the context of how other things that have happened.
I imagine this was researched with a lot of primary
Yeah.
text
Oh,
and
yeah. He
documents
even
of the
talked,
time.
he even looked at applications for what we would call unemployment
Compensation or whatever,
compensation,
yeah.
because they couldn't do their jobs.
To get, right, to
You
sort
know,
of get
there were a whole
the
factory shut
demographics
down.
of
Yeah,
that. Mhm.
there were a whole factory shut down, and he talks about how the research is a collaborative effort, which it always is. But you know, it was quite. It's a really fascinating, nice study. And you've got one there. That's
Right, the next one here, looks like it's interesting picking up on this post-hip hop generation idea. M.K. Asante Jr., It's Bigger Than Hip Hop, The Rise of the Post-Hip Hop Generation. This writer, M.K. Asante, is a well-known poet, filmmaker, and teaches at Morgan State University.
He's kind of immersed in the media stuff.
Right, media studies, has done some documentaries which I'm not familiar with, 500 Years Later and The Black Candle. So in this book he's looking at sort of the I guess the post I don't know how he'll define post hip hop, but he's looking at a 30-year history of hip hop which has gone through sort of street generated alternative art or whatever art of the streets through this whole corporate model, through probably a generation of hip hop artists in some ways taking back some of that production in their own way.
Well, it's given voice to a lot of people
Mhm.
that people didn't think, and it's huge. It has a huge economic impact on the recording industry, the whole music industry, where there have been recording companies springing up based on just
Sure.
hip hop.
Sure.
And,
And the controversies that go with it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting how it's, in some ways, I mean, I suppose there's a critique, a race, if you can say that, a race critique, a class critique now. I mean, hip hop has become a kind of, I'm gonna say flattener of some kind, but I don't know the right term for it. But you find oddly hip hop rhythms and rhymes so attractive to, say, middle class white teenagers who have literally no experience with that kind of inner city street experience that most of what hip hop talks about. So it's kind of a...
well, some of the hip hop singers did not come out of
Well,
the inner city,
Very true.
and they're making huge amount of
Right.
money singing
on
inner city
that,
singers.
there's a kind of mythology that comes through the well, certainly the language, but you know, there's something to the texture, the beat, the texture, just the pure acoustic pull of the rhythm and the style of music that goes sort of beyond the sort of text-based meaning. So to
Well, I
speak.
see kind of an evolution because it came out of the inner city, and then it's evolved into this larger. It's responding to a larger need in the culture, and so now it's starting to shape the discourse, which I find really fascinating. I think of what he's talking about in there is how this kind of eclectic element on the kind of the periphery has come toward the center, and now it is shaping major parts of the discourse and the industry. I mean, how people express themselves musically. And then the next question is, well, which he's trying to address, where is this going to go? once you've started this process. And there's debates going on about the topic. You know, there's some of them artists had a lot of vicinity and that kind of thing. But when you start working on a broader based, you know, discourse, then some of that's got to evolve, and it is evolving. And some of the stuff in the original, you know, people who were doing it had very violent lives, and you know, I mean, Tupac and people getting shot up and killed, and you know, then some people are talking about, was that really what we want as a role model? But they liked the rhythms, they liked the freshness, the authenticity of what was being talked about, and felt that addressed them more accurately than a lot of the mainstream media.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a big issue about media in here, about how that responds to the needs that we have. And I thought that was, I mean, almost puts it sort of in a postmodern deal.
Mm-hmm.
And he's one of the first people to start working on this, as far as from what I've seen, and I've read about him before. And I think it's very helpful to start looking at what's happening, you know, and from this deeper perspective, because people often think of hip hop as just sort of disposable. You get it and then go on and get something else and go on, but there's some deeper need that it's responding to, and I think it's that issue of authenticity. Well, that artist is talking about the way I feel, the way my life really is, you know, the kind of down and out, or the struggle, or the resistance against, you know, the dominant culture kind of thing. And I think that's what makes it really fascinating.
I guess in some ways it's for many of the listeners it's kind of a vicarious experience, but on the other hand, there is an either authenticity or a realness that especially maybe that listeners pick up on. That might be what they're looking for, or that it appeals, you know, it has a pull. Apart from, I suppose anybody can be deceived. You know, you find out that your album or CD or MP3 song that you download is a total corporate product, but you know, underneath it all, there may be something that sort of.
But the corporations need something to sell that is going to respond to the needs of the community, and they can't be producing something over, you know, just off in the ethers.
I think that's where some of the, if you want to say it, local control or producers who are really in the community, and rightly so, have become you know, successful producing music that's right there. I mean, the studios are, you're not going necessarily to the large corporate studios in LA or New York. There are studios that are local in neighborhoods that are producing
Well,
this
and
stuff.
there is that element as a select group at Sony, for example, going to shape all the music for the entire culture, or is someone who's closer to where the people are going to be shaping it. And that plays into this whole thing about who owns the music, who's going to get the money from it.
Right.
I mean, I've read estimates of what artists actually get from, you know, a CD, be relatively low, like $1, you know, for a $16.95 deal.
Sure.
They get $1 off of it, and they're the ones that
And that's-
created it.
Right, exactly.
And so then the whole marketing thing is skewed.
That's where the local control comes
Yeah.
in. I mean, many groups are able in some ways to produce, they really have control of their own production. They're able to produce, you know, print off, say, 500 CDs, or do it on demand, or digital music, which is distributed through inexpensive websites where they actually bypass the traditional distribution channels. But
Well,
they're
plus
not
the-
selling millions
Plus, I
necessarily.
think it's stimulated, you know, the old garage band concept again,
Mhm.
where there's a lot of people doing hip hop who may not be known, but they're starting up to doing, because it's, again, giving them voice. It's empowering them to speak about their
Right.
experiences. And they may be satisfied with that level, but it still is a lot of that going on.
It's fantastic what's actually coming out of even land-based radio, internet radio, and websites now. I mean, this whole growth of self-production, and radio is actually having a resurgence. I mean, it is actually a viable, it's not dying off because of the internet. I mean, I think a lot of that, granted, there are big issues with corporate radio. I mean, radio has seriously consolidated, but there are smaller stations still, especially internet-based as well as local low-power stations that are actually, I was going to say popularizing or foment, but putting out channels for access to this kind of music,
Well, and then with
self-produced.
the emergence of the social media, there's all these different, there's, you know, Twitter and there's Facebook and all this stuff. So the impact of these different musicians, it's hard to really get a handle around it because it's so big. I mean, you know, and they're all aware about how to get this word out.
MySpace, still popular for
Yeah.
bands.
But they're YouTube. I mean, there's all
Sure.
kinds of stuff on
now
YouTube.
the self-made media is right out
So
there.
now it's not a hierarchical linear structure where you have the corporate corporation putting out the music and it goes through the different, you know, record shops and all that stuff and played on radio. Now you have all these different things happening simultaneously.
That's why we need to have a change in the way we sort of have a think about copyright and intellectual property, I think, because we really need to free up the space to do what copyright originally did, and that was to stimulate the growth of intellectual property instead of sort of stymieing it. The way that so much is produced today by using the music of other people and stimulated by, you know, lots of different, like, sampling and rhythm sharing beats, doing a lot of cross-pollination that's got to be protected. It's got to be encouraged. We have to protect the creativity is what I'm saying, not protect, say, objects themselves. I think copyright needs to be really
But
changed.
the other thing that fascinated me is how academic research and scholarship adapts to the conditions on the ground. I mean, you know, we think that
Hopefully.
yeah, I know, and you can argue this endlessly, but in this instance he did.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying it happens all the time, and I know that in some areas it gets kind of fossilized and it's always doing the same thing kind of thing. But here he's responding to an evolution, and you know, you're an ethnomusicologist. This is where a guy is saying, oh, there's something really important going on here, and I'll dig into it. And obviously it's someone who's immersed himself in the media himself anyway. But I like the idea that he took it into a serious scholarly dimension.
Yeah.
So he's doing the research on it, trying to understand it. And I think that's an important adaptation.
We're looking at something that's built from the ground up, what they call the emic look from within, and trying to get a feel for what the people who make the music are actually saying about what they're doing.
So thanks for being on Rip Up
it was
again.
great to be here. Thank
Okay.
you so much.